and welcome to OCR History Beat Living Under Nazi Rule content videos. This video will cover the second theme within Living Under Nazi Rule, which is Control and Opposition 1933 to 1939. So one of the main methods that the Nazis used to ensure that they had control over the people and they limited opposition was terror. And I'm sure that lots of you are quite familiar with this. So I'm going to go through 6 different branches of the terror system in Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1939. So firstly, we have the SS, who were run by Heinrich Himmler. These were elite Aryan soldiers who purged enemies and aimed to protect Hitler. They were his private bodyguards. They wore black Hugo Boss uniforms, and they were later on, after 1939, the leaders of the extermination camps. They had a reputation for strict obedience to Hitler, and they were very, very trusted by him. Remember, in the previous video, we spoke about the Night of the Long Knives, and remember, it's the SS that carry out that for Hitler when they purged the SA on the 30th of June 1934. We then have the SD. So Reinhard Heydrich is in charge of the SD, and their role is the intelligence branch of the Gestapo. So they aimed to collect intelligence and spy on education, the arts, government, churches, Jewish groups, and as I said, they would then feed back to Gestapo. And the Gestapo really were the muscle then after the intelligence had been captured. So they were created by Göring in 1933, and then they were led by Himmler after 1936. So Himmler here being seen as a very influential individual in the Nazi regime, in charge of the SS and then the Gestapo from 1936. The Gestapo were the Nazi secret police force. There were only 15,000 officers throughout Germany, but many German civilians believed that there were Gestapo officers everywhere as a result of the fact that they worked on denunciations. So they relied on the German people snitching essentially to the SD, and then the Gestapo would pick up any potential opponents. Their job was to suppress opposition, and they were infamous for torturing victims for information before often killing them. We then have the police force. So the Nazis inherited the police force that already existed under the Weimar Republic, but they split the police into the Orpo, which is the ordinary police, and the Kripo, which is the criminal police. Himmler, again, his name is coming up, is the head of the police force from 1936. And the police completely gets infiltrated by the Nazis. So Nazi leaders are promoted within the police force, and their job is to provide intelligence and arrest offenders. We then have judges and courts. So again, the Nazis inherit the court system from the Weimar Republic, but judges are made to swear an oath of allegiance to Hitler. So they are going to obviously uphold Nazi values as a result of this. The courts passed more death sentences for crimes, so 40,000 Germans were executed as a result of there being more lenient systems in place to ensure that more Germans were executed for crimes perceived to be anti-Nazi. And the People's Court had no jury and a predetermined verdict. So lots of people obviously found guilty, and it almost becomes a show trial. We have concentration camps. It is really important here that you note that these are not the same as extermination camps. A concentration camp is a labour camp, and Dachau is the main concentration camp that you need to know as an example, which is created in 1933. Remember, after the Reichstag fire, 4,000 communist leaders were imprisoned as a result of the emergency decree, and Dachau is one of the places where lots of these communist leaders end up. So this is not really a place, concentration camps are not really a place that focus on the Jews being locked up there, although some were. This is much more a place for political opponents such as communists. Trade unionists also end up there, social democrats, those that were perceived as idle, criminals, homosexuals, Jews and gypsies. But the main groups that were here were political opponents such as the social democrats and the communists. Theodor Eicher reformed these to make them harsher across the period of 1933 to 34. And in 1937, Himmler, who was again involved in the whole terror system, stated that guards could not be jailed for extreme violence, which obviously gives concentration camp guards a free hand to be as aggressive and brutal as they wished to be. So just a reminder here, the main purpose of terror is to intimidate the German population into compliance, and obviously they are trying to remove any opposition that the Nazis may face. So another method used by the Nazis to control the German people and to limit opposition was propaganda. So let's have a look at some of the methods of propaganda used between 1933 and 1939. So we have newspapers. So the Nazis set up the Reich Press Chamber to control any existing newspapers. And by 1939, when World War II breaks out, the Nazis control 2/3 of those. They also published their own newspaper. A good example in the exam would be Der Stürmer, which was an anti-Semitic newspaper used to indoctrinate the German population. And we also have the Editor's Law, which was passed, which censored content. So newspapers would only be able to print pro-Nazi stories, which limits the narrative that German people are reading and helps to control the population. We then have radio. So the fancy word for this, the German terminology for this, is Volksempfänger, and you could use that in the exam to impress the examiner. The radio was the best way to spread messages in the 1930s. Remember, people don't really have televisions at this point, so radio is the best way to spread messages throughout Germany. So the Nazis set up the Reich Radio Company to control existing stations, and on these radios they played German folk music such as Wagner. There's no jazz, Jewish composers or speeches are banned, and just a reminder that these radios, the Volksempfängers, are mass produced and they are very, very cheap, which means that by 1939, 70% of Germans own one of these. Now, just a reminder here that these radios could not pick up any foreign broadcasts. So again, this is limiting the narrative that the German people hear. For example, they would hear positive messages all of the time, just coming from within Germany. So it really limits any external messages at all and make sure that Hitler can get his narrative across to the German people. We then have film. So Hitler created the Reich Film Chamber with Joseph Goebbels to limit foreign films and promote German films. And by 1939, the Nazis fund 2/3 of all films. So we have a film, for example, called The Eternal Jew, which would have spread the propaganda that we've seen in lessons multiple times. So the ideas that the Jewish population were greedy, were to blame for the First World War, etc. And the name Eternal indicates that the Nazis wanted the German people to believe that this is the way that the Jews had always been and would continue to be. So it is again indoctrinating German audiences. There would have been more subtle propaganda as well within the film. So for example, Aryans would have always played the heroes, that kind of thing. So there would be an element of subliminal messaging there really from the Nazis as well. From 1934, the Reich Cinema Law censored all scripts. So again, they have to be checked before films are produced and they have to have a pro-Nazi message. We also had rallies. So there were giant rallies held to showcase Nazi support. There were speeches, bands, parades and mock battles. And the largest rally that you could talk about in the exam is the Nuremberg Rally, where in 1934, 500 trains carried 250,000 people to the arena. And we also have the film, The Triumph of the Will, which Hitler made as well, which is a huge propaganda effort to really reinforce the support that the Nazis had. We then have the Berlin Olympics in 1936, and this is an opportunity to demonstrate Nazi Germany's power. It's a bit of an unusual event in terms of the fact that anti-Semitism is put on pause, and the reason for this is because the eyes of the world are on Germany. So they wanted to hide some of the darker sides perhaps of the ideology that they had at that time. So they removed anti-Semitic posters and they replaced them with swastikas around the country. They built a 100,000 seat stadium, which would have been extremely impressive at the time. And the German team were all Aryan and they won most gold medals. So Germany do top the medal table, which obviously reinforces to Adolf Hitler that the Aryans are supreme, which is a branch really of his ideology. It is noted here that Jesse Owens, who was the African-American long jumper who won gold, disproved Hitler's racial theory, and it's famously known that Hitler refused to shake his hand. And finally, we have posters. Nice, easy one to talk about in the exam. It's the most common form of propaganda, and the posters displayed anti-Semitic slogans and pro-Nazi party messages. They were placed all around towns and villages, and these increased during World War II. Obviously, we're going up to 1939 in this video, but just to make you aware that posters do increase after that point. The main purpose of propaganda is to win the hearts and minds of the German people and to indoctrinate them with Nazi ideology. And remember, Joseph Goebbels here is the name who you need to know for propaganda. He's the person that orchestrates all of this, obviously with Hitler's input, but it is Joseph Goebbels who makes all of this happen to control the minds of the German people. So despite the control that the Nazis clearly had through terror and propaganda, there was opposition that reared its head between 1933 and 1939. And that comes into three main categories. That comes from the youth, political opponents, and the church. So we're going to have a look at the youth first of all. So first of all, we have the Young Communists. These were left-wing, obviously the same as their adult counterparts, so in complete opposition to the Nazis, who remember are on the far right. They met in secret and dressed in anti-Nazi style clothes, and they wrote anti-Nazi leaflets. We then have the Young Christians, 2.5 million members. However, meetings were banned, so they went on illegal pilgrimages, so illegal religious journeys. The main threat from this group is the sheer number of them, which would have made Hitler feel quite wary of them as a group. So the number really is what you would need to remember if you were to speak about the Young Christians. The two main groups that we need to know are firstly the Edelweiss Pirates. So the Edelweiss Pirates were formed in 1938, a year prior to World War II, and they wore a white flower, the Edelweiss flower, to identify themselves. They organised camps, listened to radio and played songs. They wrote anti-Nazi leaflets and they graffitied. Many even picked fights with Hitler Youth members. So we see here a more aggressive kind of form of opposition from the youths in the form of the Edelweiss Pirates. And we can really see the threat that this group held, because in 1944 we had 12 Edelweiss Pirates who were hanged publicly to really deter other youths from joining the movement. And we also have the swing kids, or the swing youth. So they listened to jazz and they danced, they had long hair, wore white trousers, and Himmler set up a special Gestapo group to target them. So we can clearly see here that, again, these kids were a threat to Nazi Germany. They were arrested, many of them, and they were sent to concentration camps. So again, reinforcing the threat that the Nazis felt from them. So the two groups that I would say are the most significant to revise are the Edelweiss Pirates and the swing kids. And remember, the explanation for this really is that they went against the indoctrination. It clearly wasn't working for them. And this is such a huge problem for Adolf Hitler, because remember, these are the next generation. Hitler wants the 1,000-year Reich to rule supreme in Germany, and to do that he needs the youths on side. So these groups would have been a major form of concern, hence the fact that we see a small group of the Edelweiss Pirates hanged in public in 1944, and the fact that swing kids were being arrested and targeted by the Gestapo. In terms of political opposition, we have opposition that came from the left. So if we have a look at this kind of line of politics, we've got the Nazis on the far right, we've got the communists on the far left, and then we've got the centre parties. The Social Democrats are kind of left of centre. So we're going to have a look at the opposition that they posed. So the Social Democrats, most leaders flee in 1933. So as soon as Adolf Hitler comes to power, they know that there is not really a place for them in Nazi Germany. Some of them go underground or leave Germany and try and continue a campaign of opposition from a distance. Resistance groups, for example, in Hanover, there were only 250 members, but it was the largest one. They targeted industrial areas, so areas where there would have been lots of workers that might have been disgruntled, because the trade unions, remember, had been banned in 1933 following the Enabling Act. The Social Democrats produced anti-Nazi leaflets and posters. The Gestapo arrested 1,200 in total, but they were never going to be a huge threat because they weren't as far left or extreme left as the communists. They refused to work with them. They refused to combine. So this limited the overall impact that this group had. The other group that we know would have been natural opposition to the Nazis are the far left of the political spectrum, and that is the communists. So they are more active than the Social Democrats, and they have a visible resistance, with meetings being held, newsletters, propaganda generally, but they are easily targeted by the Gestapo, and they are the Gestapo's main kind of focus. We know that Hitler was intent on locking up as many as possible, and we can see that as early as the 28th of February 1933 with the emergency decree, which, remember, targeted 4,000 communist leaders and imprisoned them in camps such as Dachau. The communists also produced the Red Flag, which was a newspaper that had 10,000 copies a month. And we have got George Esler, who was a communist, trade unionist as well, and he tried to detonate a bomb in 1939 with the aim of killing Adolf Hitler. He was caught, obviously the plot fails, and he's imprisoned at Dachau for 5 years prior to being executed. But you could use that in the exam as a good example of communist opposition towards the Nazis, perhaps to argue that their control was not as strong as some may perceive it to have been. And we've just got a historian's perspective on the opposition here to the Nazis. So the interpretation from Richard J. Evans states, of all the groups who held out against Nazism in the early years of the Third Reich, the communists were the most persistent and the most undaunted, and they paid the greatest price as a consequence. So this is really indicating to you the harsh punishments that were given to the communists as a result of their visible and quite brave opposition. So the final group that we have that opposed the Nazis during this time period were the church. A large percentage of Germany were religious. We had 22 million Catholics, who, remember, Catholics follow the Pope's guidance, so they would have arguably been seen as more of a threat because they have an external influence. And then we have 40 million Protestants. So in July 1933, as a result really of Hitler seeing the Catholics as a potential threat, Hitler and Pope Pius signed the Concordat. The Concordat is an agreement between the Catholic Church and Adolf Hitler, and they basically say that they are not going to interfere in one another's business. Hitler will continue to protect the churches in Germany and the Pope will not interfere. Despite this, though, Hitler closes all church schools and begins to arrest priests, so the Concordat does not stay in place very long. For Protestants, a new Reich Church was set up, and pastors had to sign an oath of allegiance to Hitler. So all promises of non-interference here have been broken, and Protestants are very heavily involved in setting up this new Reich Church, which perhaps initially wasn't seen as overtly indoctrinating the public, but that is what it is there to do. So all of the ministers within these churches would have been pro-Nazi. There would have been pro-Nazi ideology woven into sermons that were given to the public, and as a result of this becomes quite handy for Hitler really as another method of control. Despite this, though, we do have opposition. So probably the most significant opposition that we see in Nazi Germany is Cardinal Galen. So he was a Catholic bishop and he preached against Nazi racial policy. He spoke out against the Nazi T4 programme, which we know as the euthanasia campaign. And remember, this targeted people with disabilities. So we had disabled people within Germany being killed of starvation, lethal injection and gas. It's the first time we see gas used, and Galen uses his platform to speak out against this. Because he is so high profile, the Nazis decide that they are not going to kill him. So interestingly, despite the fact that he's very significant opposition, they decide that they are going to let him live. We have Martin Niemöller, who starts the non-Nazi church, or the confessional church, with 6,000 pastors, and this church preaches openly against Nazi racial policy. So again, very, very brave opponent of the Nazis. He was sent to Sachsenhausen and then Dachau, but he does survive. But nonetheless, he spends time in concentration camps as a result of his defiance to the party. We then have Pope Pius. So after signing the Concordat, Pope Pius writes a letter which condemned the Nazis, and it was smuggled into Germany, and it was read out in churches. So the Pope here making a very kind of visible statement that he is not in support of the Nazis after the Concordat has been broken. So yeah, this letter that is spread around Germany clearly would encourage Catholics perhaps to go against Adolf Hitler, which would have been a threat. This letter is called With Burning Anxiety, so again that could be referenced in the exam. And we have Paul Schneider, who was a Protestant pastor who joined Niemöller's church, and he preached against the Nazis. He was arrested in 1934 and again in 1935, and he bans any Nazis from his sermons. So again, very clearly, openly anti-Nazi. He was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp and was executed. And then we have Jehovah's Witnesses. So Jehovah's Witnesses are pacifists, which means they do not engage in any violence. So they wouldn't get involved in World War II when that breaks out in 1939. They wrote anti-Nazi leaflets and 6,000 of them were imprisoned. So we can clearly see here that despite the control that the Nazis had through terror and propaganda, we still had some exceptionally brave individuals who went against the Nazis in the form of youth opposition, political opposition and church opposition. So I hope that video has been helpful for theme 2 on control and opposition between 1933 and 1939, and the next content video will be about changing lives 1933 to 1939.